Dun it, dun it, dun it, dun it, dun it, dun it, dun 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 dun. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Amok Time, which is episode 5 of season 2 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek The Original Series, one episode at a time. In this video I will cover the second season episode, Amok Time. So Amok Time is the episode where Kirk and McCoy notice that Spock is behaving very strangely. He's being erratic, he's being emotional, he's being very angry and upset, and he wants to go to Vulcan, but Kirk has another mission to attend to until McCoy does an examination on him and finds that if Spock doesn't go to Vulcan, he will die. So they go to Vulcan and find that it is part of a Vulcan mating drive known as Pung Far, which involves pumping his body full of adrenaline to the point he'll die unless he returns home to Vulcan and takes a mate. We find there's a whole ritual there where he has a wife waiting for him to commence the marriage ceremony. However, during the ceremony that Kirk and McCoy are invited to, she refuses and instead elects to have a challenge done where she wants a fight to the death between Kirk and Spock, and Kirk agrees to this, not knowing it was to the death, and so McCoy uses some trickery to fake Kirk's death, in which snaps Spock out of it, and Spock realizes that his betrothed would rather marry this other dude, so he lets her do that, and he returns back to the Enterprise to find that Kirk is in fact alive and well, and cracks a huge smile at this, and then denies doing so, and everything returns to normal. So, this is a classic. It is one of the favorites of the original series. I didn't check to see where it was on IMDb, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty high. I've seen it on a lot of top 10 lists. And again, I'll be honest, to my opinion, when I was first watching this as a teenager in the 90s, I didn't care that much for this episode. Like, I didn't hate it. I thought it was fine. I thought it was an okay episode. I just didn't see the big deal over it. But, you know, it wasn't until very recently, in fact, just a couple of years ago, when I did my rewatch for actually, that was earlier last year. It was just 1 year ago. Anyway, where I did my rewatch for the season reviews I did on my channel, that I actually really Actually, it's the first time I really appreciated this episode. And again, I talked about this before, is when I sit down and analyze it and think about it and overanalyze it, and that's when I really started to appreciate this episode, because especially watching it with the other Trek episodes, I noticed a particular uptake in quality in this episode as compared to many of the other episodes. I think some of it has to do with writing and acting, but also, and this is just, a guess. I don't know that if this is the case, but it seems to me, because I'm watching the special editions like that were revived and upgraded to HD and put in special effects, more modern special effects, although it was done in the early 2000s, but it's still way more modern than the 60s ones. And a lot of times they do enhance the episodes, and it's just my guess, but I feel like they put more effort into this one. Like, they upgraded the visual quality. I'm not talking about adding special effects, because you do it about the same to every episode, but I'm talking about like just the quality, the shot frame quality of it. It seems more cleaner in this episode than other episodes of TOS. So maybe I'm just my guess, but I feel like they put more intention to this, which I could see them doing, since this is one of the fan favorite episodes. I could see them putting more attention to this as opposed to something like Cat's Paw or Who Mourns for Adonais, which not that many people. Those are just throwaway episodes. But that's what I feel, and yeah, and so I noticed and I love the style of this episode as well, particularly when they're on the Vulcan planet and the way that it's shot. It is kind of 60s, to be fair. It's shot like kind of a psychedelic like music video or something, but I think it really works for the episode, the way they intercut, and they use like Dutch angles, and they intercut very the editing, how they cut back and forth, and it really stimulates the kind of madness that Spock is feeling. How they cut back and forth between the Vulcan shaking the bells, and like they do a weird Dutch angle at a tilt of T'Pau, and then you see Spock like going crazy, and they like do that rapid fire, of course, and combined with the great music they had. I think stylistically, it's really well done, and I think it's one of my favorite. It's probably my favorite stylistic scene in the entire show, because most of the show is just shot like a '60s TV show. Where this, it felt more they were doing more, being more creative than just typical, you know. And the way a lot of TV shows were shot, and it's not this way in the modern era, except for on network television. Network television is a whole other beast. But they would just, have blanket the set and lighting so they could shoot from any angle they want, and so they could use multiple cameras so they could get the shots done as soon as possible. If you know anything about filmmaking, each shot in a film, each shot is done with a single camera and directly, and it has specific lighting for each scene, and the lighting's very thought out, and it's a part of the mood, and they use lighting a lot. And to be fair, the original series also uses lighting a lot, but I hated the way it uses lighting. Like a lot of times it does this thing where it has shadows on Kirk's face, and only his eyes are lit, and they do shit like that, which I think is dumb. I don't like, but for the most part, it is shot like a typical '60s TV show where it's just bathed in lighting. But here it's not the lighting so much, but it's just what they do with the shot and the style that they do with it that I actually think is super impressive. And I think this episode the story is very strong for what it contributes to, how the kind of friendship Kirk and Spock has, and then of course, as I alluded to in my intro, this music that has become very classic, well known. It was you've seen often in pop culture. It's referenced, and it was very one of the most iconic pieces of music, and it was first introduced in this episode. Although I will say that me personally, I always identified this music more with the episode Gamesters of Triskelion, which I liked more when I was a teenager. Don't ask me why. And I was introduced to first. Like, I saw that episode before I saw this one. But, in pop culture, this is the episode it's associated with for good reason, because it's the one that introduced the music, and it's actually, in retrospect, the most iconic use of this music as well. In many people's opinions, not just mine. So yeah, this is, that music is, really awesome. And probably definitely one of the better pieces of music the original series used, where most of the music I'm not a fan of. It's just outdated in '60s, but this it still works to this day. Now, I have a lot of nitpicks with this episode. That's why I don't think I'd put this in the top 10. I don't think, I'm not sure if it made my top 20. It might have last time, but I don't know. Just watching it again this time, I just noticed the plot is very contrived. I'm sorry to say. Because, alright, first of all, let's get into this Pung Far thing. In this episode, Spock starts acting crazy, and Kirk wants to know why, and he won't tell anyone. And then it's to the point where he's going to die in 8 days, yet he still doesn't tell anyone. And whenever anyone asks, he's like, "This is a private matter, leave it alone." And Kirk has to, like, super pry in order to get him to admit it. And even when Spock finally admits it, he's like very coy about it, where he's like, "It involves Vulcan biology." And oh, by the way, I fucking love Kirk's line. Kirk seems like a dimwit sometimes. Like in the last episode, Who Mourns for Adonais, where there was a hand coming towards the Enterprise, Kirk is like, "Is that a hand?" Like, yeah, Kirk, it's a fucking hand in space. No, it's an energy beam, you field, you dumbwit. Anyway, and in this episode, oh god, it's my favorite dimwit Kirk line of all time, where Spock's like, "It involves Vulcan biology," and Kirk's response is, "Vulcan biology? You mean as in the biology of Vulcans?" Yes, that's what he just said, fucking Kirk. Goddamn. Oh, I fucking love that line. But anyway, what was my point? Oh yeah, my point. My point is that they had to pry this information out of Spock, and Kirk had to promise that he would treat this completely confidential and wouldn't tell anyone. And when Kirk asked permission to go back to Vulcan, and after he knew this, he wouldn't tell the Starfleet Commodore why. He's just like, "Trust me, Commodore, I can't tell you why, but we need to go back to Vulcan." Now, there are many issues I have with this. And I don't want to say canon is one, because it's not the fact that later canon will contradict this, because I think it should contradict this, because I think this is dumb. And not even having to leave the original series, in season 3, there's the episode Cloud Miners, where Spock is on this random backwards planet, which I don't know how, as a member of the Federation, when it still treats the citizens like shit. But anyway, that's I'll get more into that when I revisit that episode. But he's in this planet, Stratos, I believe it's called, or at least the cities, and there's this woman he meets that kind of has the hots for him, and she asks him about how the fact that that Vulcans only have sex every 7 years. So this is like an ultra secret thing. Kirk had to pry this information out of him in order to, even though his life fucking depended on it, Spock still refused to tell anyone until Kirk pried this information from him. And yet, some random woman on this random planet, backwards planet, that barely has any contact with Vulcans, she knows about it. And Spock is perfectly willing to talk right out in the open with her about it, even though his life isn't in danger and he barely knows this woman. And if you go further outside of the original series, all the way up to Enterprise, you see T'Pol casually mentioning Pungfar to Trip and Archer while having dinner, and Trip already knew about Pungfar and brought it up to T'Pol, and she casually, mentions it and talks about it. And of course, Voyager knowing freely about Pungfar is acceptable, because that takes place 100 years from now, so you could say, oh, maybe attitudes changed. But Enterprise is set 100 years before this, and the humanity as Starfleet, even at this very early age in Starfleet history, that they don't know, haven't had that many alien encounters, they know full well easily about Pungfar. And there's no reason, and this is what I mean by this is something that should be retconned, because there's no reason why they shouldn't know these things, and there's no logical reasons why Spock and Vulcan should be so fucking tight-lipped and tight-assed about telling others about this. In fact, it's the kind of stigma and shame that Spock is expressing over sex is very human-like. And so I think is a very uncharacteristic of Vulcans, and that they are having this human-esque stigma about sex to the point where he absolutely refuses to mention. He'd rather die than mention this to the outsider, which is highly illogical. And, to be fair to this episode, Kirk does bring up that's illogical on Spock's, lame excuses. Logic does out the window when the pung far happens or whatever. But no. I'm sorry. I think that the Vulcans, and because later portrayals do show the Vulcans being very logical about it, which is a hell of a lot more in character. So, in other words, the whole reason that Spock is being tight-lipped and refusing to tell anyone is a plot contrivance, so that the characters in the audience wouldn't know actually what was going on with Spock, and it would be more of a mystery so they could have a plot. It was a very bad, very obvious plot contrivance that really annoys me. And there's no reason why. And in fact, when Spock was being all like coy about it, when he was finally telling Kirk he was like, involved Vulcan biology. Why don't you just say we have sex? He should be like, our bodies go crazy and we have to go have sex every 7 years. That seems like it was illogical to state it out. There's no reason to dance around the issue and be coy about, oh, you mean the biology of Vulcans? Oh, I get a kick out of that. Anyway, so that's not the only issue I have with this episode. Unfortunately, there's also and I've talked about this before in other videos I did, the whole rituals they do at this marriage ceremony seems very, I don't know, the cultural aspects they give to Vulcans this episode seems outside of what would be logical. Now, there are some classic Vulcan traits this episode does establish. For example, live long and prosper, the whole Vulcan salute, and that saying was established in this episode, I believe. And that's something, of course, which would become very commonplace and well known amongst, in fact, pretty well known even in the cultural mindset outside of Star Trek fans. But it becomes a staple of Star Trek and Vulcan culture. So there, and some of the way that some of the Vulcans behave is in keeping with that. But some isn't. Like the way they have all the Vulcans shaking the thing with bells going, that seems very illogical to me. And I don't know. You could say maybe that's just a cultural thing that they established, which I'm willing to go with. Fine. But a couple things I'm not willing to go with. A fight to the death. That just because she doesn't want to get married. And by the way, I'll remind you that and this is something I actually first noticed when watching this episode, again, paying close attention to it. T'Pol mentions that T'Pring can't get out of the marriage, that there's no such thing to divorce in Vulcan culture. Bullshit. And not to mention the whole betrothal thing, like where they get 7-year-olds and Spock says it's less than a marriage and more than a betrothal. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but that seems very illogical to me as well to have randomly. Although, again, see, Vulcans wouldn't really choose their mates according to like love the way humans were, because they don't express love and emotions in that manner. So, okay, I maybe would be willing to go with that as well, but then again, you throw in, oh, well, they can't divorce at all. They have to have the men fight to the death. No, that is highly illogical. And then don't give me that, oh, the Pungfar is not logical bullshit. No, I don't buy this for Vulcan culture, period, full stop, end of sentence. It's totally out of character. And, to be fair, future versions of Star Trek 86 this as well, which they should because it's dumb. And as something else I noticed for the first time, that the language that the pal uses is a bit unfortunate. She tells T'Pring that whoever wins the fight, you will become their property. And she refers to several times as T'Pring becoming her husband's property. It's like, you will become Spock's property. Yeah. So that is... I feel that you could say it's the 60s, but I feel like they're trying to, when developing the Vulcan culture, they were trying to maybe model it off of more, let's say, primitive cultures that have some of those primitive mindsets, which they shouldn't have, because the Vulcan should be an advanced culture, not a primitive one. They should be more this is completely illogical for them to refer to T'Pring as someone's property. That's yeah, I don't even know if I need to say anything else about that. Since I noticed, I was like, ooh, oh god, yeah, no, that is bad choice of words there. But yeah, and so T'Pring wants to be with this other dude, Stani, and instead of just being like, well, you know what, Spock, I don't feel like marrying you anymore, I'm going to hook up with this guy instead. She has to have them fight to the death. And by the way, another huge nitpick I have in this episode, and I think it was really bothering me this time. Kirk, like, they say to Kirk, like, do you accept the challenge? He wants to fight you. And Kirk's like, well, I could just wind him and knock him out, and then they'll be in the end of it. And then they start the fight, and once they begin, get ready for the fight, once Kirk says, I accept the challenge, and they're like, okay, they're setting up for the fight, and T'Pau is just like, I almost said T'Pau, but anyway, T'Pau is just like, yeah, if you guys survive the first round, then we'll move on to the second round. And Kirk's like, wait a second, what do you mean if we survive? And she's like, well, this fight's to the death. Come on! You couldn't have told him that before he accepted the challenge? I mean, that is a mighty fine bit of plot contrivance right there for you. I mean, what a dickhead T'Pau is being for not maybe mentioning the fact when Kirk is like, Kirk, you can back out, you don't have to accept, you're all good, you can back out, you don't have to accept this. Maybe mention the fact the fight's to the fucking death. I think that's kind of an important piece of information that he should have, instead of like waiting till after he accepts it and like, oh yeah, by the way, it's to the death. It's like, whoa, wait a second there. It's like, no, fuck you, Kirk, you already accepted, you can't back out now. Like, why the fuck? Like, what the hell? That's such an asshole move. Again, but it's plot contrivance because they wanted to have this cool fight scene between Kirk and Spock, and so they couldn't give him that information before because, yeah, he would fucking not accept if that was the case. And by the way, another thing I was thinking of, when the whole thing, the reason why Kirk accepted is because he thought that the Stani dude would actually kill him and that Spock wouldn't stand a chance against him, and McCoy said that because in his current state, no, he doesn't stand a chance against that Vulcan guy. Then the whole fight system seems rigged if one of the dudes is going through punk fart and the other one doesn't, and the one who's not has a major advantage over the one who is. Again, it seems like kind of a fucked up system. I don't know, I'm just saying here. And so, yeah, and so you can guarantee a lot of these things were retconned. They didn't, in the future incarnations, they never used the term property. And And although they did keep the fight thing, but they changed it a bit. Something I actually complained about when I reviewed or talked about Voyager, because they kind of played it off as, oh, you can either, when you're going through the Punk Fire, you can either have sex or you can just get in a big fight with someone. And they didn't even fight to the death, and then, oh, the Punk Fire's over, it's solved. Which is completely not what this episode established. This episode was saying that the fighting doesn't cure the Punk Fire. It's the fact that Spock had thought he killed his best friend, and the shock of that is what stopped the Punk Fire, not just randomly fighting someone and getting it out of your system. But anyhow, I was actually against that retcon, but having them fight to the death is, illogical. Use that terminology. Yeah, so I guess now is as good as time as any to bring up Strange New Worlds. Speaking of stuff that will retcon later on, Strange New Worlds definitely retconned this episode. It is definitely inconsistent. It breaks canon. It's not consistent with this episode. Now, whether or not you think that's a good or bad thing is a matter of opinion, and I'm of the opinion that it's mostly a good thing. Like, it kind of annoys me in some parts, but overall, like, I think it makes more sense and it works better for what they are doing on that show. So I approve of the retcon. You have my approval, my go ahead. But acknowledge that it's a fucking retcon. I'm sorry. When I was doing my reviews for Strange New Worlds, and I pointed out the fact that this was a retcon, I had people arguing, no, it's not. It's not a retcon. And no, I'm sorry. It is a retcon. Just acknowledge that it is. It's not saying that's a bad thing. Like, whether or not you think it's a bad thing or a good thing is totally up to you. It's your opinion. There's no judgment attached to the statement of fact that it is a retcon. It's just a statement of fact. It is a retcon. Now, whether or not you think it should be one, or it is one, or it could be, or not it is one, but whether or not it's good or bad is totally an opinion set. I'm passing no judgment on the fact that it's a retcon, just pointing out the fact that it is. And when someone tried to say, because I pointed out that, Uhura and Chapel in Strange New Worlds met T'Pring and knew about her, and they were like, oh, that's not necessarily a retcon. Actually, it is. And I even quoted the scene in the comment section in this episode where they go on the bridge and T'Pring appears on the view screen, and Uhura herself says, oh, she's lovely, Spock. Who is she? And Spock replies, she's T'Pring, my wife. And everyone looks shocked, especially Nurse Chapel. She's like, oh my god, your wife? And of course, Strange New Worlds, Uhura and Chapel had already met and talked to T'Pring and knew full well who she was. Also, by the way, the Spock was, they never stated it outright, but they were heavily implying that Spock had not seen T'Pring since she was a child. When they showed Spock in his quarters at one point looking at pictures of T'Pring, and it was as a 7-year-old, and he mentioned we were betrothed or whatever when we were 7, and so it was heavily implied that they didn't really know each other. And of course they're in a long-term relationship in Strange New Worlds. And so that most certainly is a retcon. Now, I like what they're doing with T'Pring and Strange New Worlds, so I'm okay with the retcon, but it is one! Just acknowledge that it is one. It just frustrates me when people try to come up with, just in denial, or try to come up with BS excuses of why it isn't one. It is. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it is. But anyway, another thing Strange New Worlds retcons is, and this is something I've heard other reviewers complain about, is Spock and T'Pring having sex on a regular basis. Now, this episode itself does not explicitly say that the Pungfar is the only time Vulcans have sex. It states that they do have to have sex every 7 years, but it doesn't say they can't have sex outside of this cycle. However, there were other mentions in the Star Trek franchise which did say this. The two examples I gave before when they were talking about Pungfar cloud miners, they specifically say that the Vulcans only have sex during Pungfar, and that chick was like, oh, is there nothing that can disturb this cycle? And Spock is just like, well, great beauty has always been disturbing. Which means it's possible for them to have sex outside of Pungfar, but it's not common. It's very uncommon. Which is not what they're in Strange New Worlds they're portraying as quite common. And then also the Enterprise example I gave, where they were heavily implying that Vulcans only had sex every 7 years and not outside of it. We're here that seemed like normal for them to have a sexual relationship on a regular basis, which, again, is something I think should be retconned. I think it actually makes more sense. And again, I like what they're doing with Spock and T'Pring in Strange New Worlds, so I'm actually approve full force of that retcon. I'm fine with that. And, yeah. But, anyway, so... Okay, let me get back to nitpicks. Sorry, I said I liked this episode, but I do have a lot of nitpicks. So, Kirk, McCoy gives Kirk this shot to fake his death. But it just so happens to take effect right at the time Spock is strangling. That's perfect timing. That's some very convenient timing. What if Kirk just randomly passed out in the middle of fighting, so they made it obvious that he was injected with something? Or what if Spock actually had killed him before the thing took effect? It was a very iffy. The whole thing is very iffy about the whole thing. Anyway. Anyway. Also, since we're bringing up other canon, by the way, T'Pau. It's hard for me to watch this episode and not think of T'Pau in Enterprise, because they actually did introduce a younger version of T'Pau in the trilogy of episodes in Season 4, The Forge. The Forge, The Awakening, and Kirshara. Which I love those episodes, and actually it took me a while to realize that the character they were introducing in that episode, T'Pau, was the same one from Amok Time. Now, unlike the other examples I get, this actually fits very nicely into canon, because actually it kind of enhances the episode for me, thinking of her as the same character from Enterprise, because it actually makes it make a lot more sense, because we see Kirk and the other Starfleet admirals talking about how revered T'Pau is, and how she's such a huge figure in Starfleet history, and how when she made her request, Starfleet had to bow to her because she's such a revered figure. And that always felt kind of hollow, like I was being told this and not shown it. It's like, oh yeah, she's well known. But seeing her backstory in Enterprise actually makes sense. Why she would be so well revered, and because she was a part of what helped overthrow the evil, what do they call it, Central Command? Well, I can't remember what they called it. But there's Vulcans that were being dicks to humanity throughout the first 3 seasons of Enterprise. That changed, and the Vulcans had a much stronger, better relationship with humanity, and they started embracing the Vulcan mind meld. Which, again, the fact that Enterprise is saying that it used to be taboo, I think is kind of inconsistent, because the way they talk here is like, thousands of years we've always embraced this. Always. There's never been a period of time where there's a bunch of asshole dickheads who would persecute us for doing mind melds. That never happened. At least that's my interpretation. But anyway, yeah. But other than that, I think, the way that T'Pau formed a relationship with Archer, and at first had no opinion, strong opinion of humanity, but learned to appreciate them more and was involved in becoming a Federation member, one could assume. Yeah, so then seeing that backstory actually enhances this episode for me. So that's actually, I when Kirk talks about how much of a revered figure she is, I feel it more. It's like it means a lot more to me now than it would before that episode came out. But anywho, one of my favorite scenes of this episode that I do have to talk about is when Spock is going through the Pung forest, and he's in the midst of it, and Kirk had made the order finally after Spock told him about it. Kirk had finally made the order to go to Vulcan, and Uhura calls to tell him this, but he's just so pissed off when Uhura's communicating over this, the view screen. Spock just screams, "Leave me alone! Leave me alone!" Just smashes the screen. This is something that I often thought of in my own mind throughout my personal life when someone's bothering me. when I just am upset, I just need some alone time, and I'm just trying to do something to someone, particularly when my dad would often yelling at some stupid bullshit, and he would be like, "Mark!" and I'd be in my mind, I just picture myself doing the Spock thing going, "Leave me alone! Leave me alone!" Anyway, I still still think about that scene every time. And so Nurse Chapel gets, she's there to serve Spock soup, and when he allows her to do it, she's so happy. "Oh, you let me make your food." Anyway, oh, let me cook for this man. Sorry. Anyway, 60s. Yeah. God, yeah, I don't want to forget anything because I'm sure there's other things I could mention about this episode. Well, yeah, I talked about the Live Long and Prosper, the weird Vulcan shaking the bells and shit. The special effects. I mentioned before that this is a special edition that they threw in the overshot scenes of the cliff of where they are with the Vulcan hull. Usually most of the special edition stuff they throw in is just space shots or shots of a planet, but here we actually see in one of the on the planet, an exterior of the location art, and I think it does super enhance the episode. Like I said, I think it really makes it better and brings it all to bear. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about this episode. So, let me now thank my Patreon supporters for supporting my channel. Thank you so much. It does really help out the channel so much. We have Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavalles, Brian A., Alessandro Migalacio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you very much for your support. Now I got a few comments from the aforementioned patrons on this episode. First comment is from Ricky. "This is a classic episode. I've always loved this one as this finally explores more of the Vulcan culture as well as going to the planet itself. The Pung Far in which Spock goes through was very interesting as we get to see Spock having strong emotions. I think this episode's story was compelling and I totally bought that Kirk would go out of his way to help his friend. Though I will say that this episode is seen different in canon when you know the relationship and history with Spock and T'Pring from Strange New Worlds, but that's fine. I love their story in Strange New Worlds and it doesn't diminish this episode, so a great episode in my top 20, so my rating is a 9 out of 10. Yeah, I agree. The T'Pring thing does not diminish this episode at all. Next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells. Amok Time, a classic episode introducing the phrase "live long and prosper," the Vulcan salute, and the famous TOS fight music. I enjoy seeing Vulcan, and the fight is gripping and amusing at times. I feel slightly let down by another joke at Spock's expense when he is delighted to find out Kirk is alive, though. I'm hoping that Mark will explain in an amusing way how this episode ties in with Strange New Worlds. 8 out of 10 from me. Well, I'm afraid my way of explaining it wasn't that amusing. But, yeah, it doesn't fit, but I've already talked about it, and that's okay. It's okay with me. Yeah, the whole thing with Spock, like, smiling, going, "Jim!" I thought was really dumb, too. I didn't really appreciate that either. Anyway, last comment is from Maddie Jester. An iconic episode, plenty of Spock and Vulcan backstory here for the franchise to work with for decades. Who doesn't love the fight scene music? I'm willing to hand wave any to bring Strange New World inconsistencies. It doesn't really matter. If you're new to Star Trek, this is required watching. 9 out of 10. Yeah, the Strange New World thing doesn't really matter. Anyway, my rating for Amok Time out of 10, I'm actually going to go with an 8. Extremely good. This is a downgrade from when I did my season review, because when I did my season review, even though I didn't state it in the video, I gave it a 9. But, yeah, watching it again, seeing all the nitpicks I have and how contrived the plot is, it made me bring it down to an 8, because, yeah, the whole thing with Spock not simply telling Kirk in the first place what Pungfire is, it's hard to buy. And the whole fight to the death thing, also hard to buy. And the fact that T'Pau didn't bother to mention to Kirk that the fight was to the death was hard to buy. And McCoy's, like, medicine of, just happened to work at the exact time it needed to fake Kirk's death, also hard to buy. But you might say, well, we have so many complaints about this episode, why give it an 8? I still like it. Regardless of all the nitpicks and minor complaints I have, the style of it is amazing. And as I said, the quality of this episode was top-notch. The dialogue was written well. The acting was really well. It was a very engaging episode. It was even as contrived as the fight scene was. It was good to see, cool to see. You were engaged, you were involved. And as I said, the editing style and the stylistic way they put you in Spock's madness, I thought was brilliant. So I can understand why I would give this episode a 9. And it's a strong 8 to be sure, but yeah, there are way too many contrivances in this episode for me to ignore, but still a really good episode. So that is it for my review of Amok Time. So coming up next on my channel, if I can bring up my schedule, where am I at? Amok Time. So on Wednesday we'll be over on Patreon for my revisited for the Doomsday Machine. That's over on Patreon for those who support me on Patreon. I already did a review for the Doomsday Machine, but I will revisit it and expand upon it and, revisit my review for it. Then Thursday, the premiere of Star Trek Picard. We'll see how that goes. And then on Saturday will be my review for Wolf in the Fold, which will be, of course, public back on my main channel. A new review for Wolf in the Fold. So that's what's coming up on Enchantment of Eternity. So be sure to check that out as I do that, as well as cover many more Star Trek videos and videos on many other topics as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.